This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at KWZ Honey. I'll do a writing sample on this 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, and I'll also take a look at some writing samples that I've done on other papers. I'll compare KWZ Honey to some similar inks from my collection, and finally I'll take a look at the results of the water resistance test. KWZ Honey came off the nib of my glass dip pen nice and uniformly, and the swatch that I did with my tweezers is nice and crisp, and there's a bit of shading to be seen. I'll begin with my Graphon Faber-Castell that has an extra fine stainless steel nib. It feels a touch dry but smooth, so it's not unpleasant on this smooth Tomoe River paper. Next, I've got a TWSBI Mini with a fine stainless steel nib. Alright, this TWSBI nib feels smooth, but you wouldn't be able to tell it by this ink smear. It feels dry. It feels like a smooth, dry nib. It feels even drier than the Graphon Faber-Castell did, the Ambition. It was a different kind of dry feeling. The extra fine had just a touch more feedback, but this one was actually smoother. This one, though, was more unpleasant, so I'm going to have to put a little sad face here so that I'll know the difference between these two. The Ambition was also dry and smooth, but it was more pleasant. I'll put a smiley face on it. Next, I've got my Quebeco AL Sport in the Golden Espresso finish. I've been excited about trying this ink with this pen and nib combination. I don't know if I mentioned, but this is the 14 karat fine nib. Alright, these two from the ink smear look like they have a similar wetness, but you can tell by the writing sample this one looks a bit darker and it was more pleasant. It is smooth but doesn't have that dry feeling. Next, I'll be using my Pilot E95S with a 14 karat fine nib. This isn't quite as smooth as the AL Sport was, but it's pretty smooth and it's nice. You can see it's putting down a lot of ink. I do like this one. It's a toss-up between these two right now. Next, I've got my Sailor 1911 Standard with a 14 karat medium nib. Alright, still it looks decently wet, except the writing sample looks a little more yellow in places. You can see on the scribble here compared to the Pilot. And There's a bit of feedback. I wouldn't say the feedback is unpleasant, but you can really hear it. So it makes it seem like the feedback is worse than it really is. I'm going to put that there's quite a bit of feedback, but it's nice. And the feedback is mostly just auditory. You can hear it. Next, I've got a Quebeco Perchao all black with a stainless steel medium nib. This feels pretty smooth. I can really hear the feedback, but it's even smoother, or it's much smoother than the Sailor 1911, but I can really hear the feedback, and oddly enough, it doesn't feel dry, but it looks dry. It looks much more yellow. Again, you can see that in the scribble. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and put, you can tell by looking at it that it looks dry. I'm going to put that it's smooth. Next, I've got my Pilot Pluminix with a cursive medium nib, stainless steel. This one looks dry and it feels dry also. I feel like I have to put some pressure on the nib to get the ink to grab onto the paper. Next, I've got a Quebeco Lilliput with a stainless steel broad nib. Yeah, this broad nib is just glassy smooth. This would be a good nib to put in that golden espresso. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. A bit of a hard start there. Okay, while that dries, I'll show some of the other writing samples. Now, I haven't been showing all of the writing samples that I do in my most recent videos, but I want to go ahead and show some of those for this ink. You can see on this Rhodia paper in my ink swatch how wide of a range of colors you get from this ink, and that really shows up in the writing for some of these wetter nibs. My favorites were the Quebeco Sport that had the gold nib in it, the E95S I really liked, and my Sailor 1911 looked really good, and the broad nib in the Quebeco I really liked. It was really smooth. Now on the stub nib it looks really nice, but like I mentioned in the previous writing sample with the Pluminix, with this wider stub nib, I had that same feeling that I really needed to exert a little more pressure on the paper to get the ink to grab onto it. You can see when I first started writing, it's not wanting to grab the paper. So this ink likes a wetter writing nib. I don't have my lower quality copy paper yet, but this writing sample I was able to see that I don't really like this ink on low quality paper. It comes out flat, and this ink is has nice shading properties. You can see when you're using better quality paper, and it looks flat and plain, and there's absolutely no shading. It felt decently nice to write with, those same nibs that I mentioned earlier, but even on this better quality, thicker copy paper, it was starting to bleed through. So this isn't an ink that would be enjoyable to use on poor quality paper. I haven't been showing my writing samples that I do in my Leuchtturm bullet journal, but I've still been doing those, and this ink just looks beautiful. The shading is just beautiful on the Leuchtturm paper. And I'm seeing, I don't know if this will come across on the camera, but there is just a slight gold halo of sheen in the heavier parts. Just beautiful. I don't have many inks that are similar to KWZ Honey. The first one that I thought of, though, was Robert Oster Cafe Crema, and they just behave slightly differently. KWZ Honey really grabs onto the paper and flows off the nib very nicely. It seems to have a really good lubrication. Robert Oster Cafe Crema seems a bit drier. It had more trouble grabbing on to the paper and holding on to it. You can see from the scribble it's a little bit wispier. Sailor 50 States Texas is a bit more brown, but they do have some similarities. The way that the shading that you see in those two is similar. KWZ Honey leans a little more yellow, with Texas leaning a little more brown. And I threw Noodler's Rome Burning in here because it's a yellowish type of ink, a little off yellow, but it is just a feathering disaster. So out of all of these, KWZ Honey and Sailor 50 States Texas are my favorites. KWZ Honey is not water resistant. It leaves just the slightest shadow of ink behind, but it's not legible. And finally, the writing sample on Tomoe River. On the swatch, I've got one little spot that acted like it was going to bleed through. I'm really surprised by the swatch here. I thought I was going to get an amazing dark to light shading like I got on Rhodia, but there's just one small dark patch on this end and down here. The scribble from the glass dip pen looked pretty nice. Out of all of these, I like the looks of the Quebeco AL Sport, the gold nib that I have in there, and my Pilot E95S. And I'm glad this looks so good in my E95S. I've been searching for an ink that I enjoy using in this. I always want to put a burgundy ink in here because of the pen being a burgundy color, but I don't use burgundy inks that much anymore. And I like the way this ink looks with the pen, with all the gold hardware. And I had been considering sending off my E95S to get it turned into a fine stub nib, because I just don't use it that often. It writes really wet. You can see, even though it's a Japanese fine nib, it's more on par with my German fine nib and with my Sailor medium nib. Those are all in the same ballpark. And I thought about getting this turned into a stub so that it wouldn't be quite as wet and kind of blobby, but I like that this pen puts down quite a bit of ink. That works with this KWZ Honey. It looks good. So that might be a permanent pen and ink pairing. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.